I'm Matt Bin. I'm a transportation planner at Metro in the investment areas group. And years ago, I've been at Metro for I think like 22 or 23 years. Years ago, I used to work with Kyle and Peter and Aaron in the modeling group. So I have some background in modeling. But generally, we work on corridor projects and usually transit projects. So this is a little bit new to me. But I often work as kind of the liaison between the whatever project we're working on and the modeling. Alex?
And I'm Alex Orshak, transportation planner with Metro, also in the investment areas group. Like Matt, I work on a lot of different transportation projects. I've been working on Southwest Corridor, earthquake-ready Burnside Bridge, enhanced transit corridors, and most recently, interstate bridge replacement. So a variety of transportation projects around the region.
All right, thanks.
I think I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
That's all right,
I was just gonna interrupt here real quick. Okay, so it looks like according to the agenda here, you guys have about the next half hour or so, 35 minutes. Again, if you're just joining us, let's save questions for the end. Let these guys get through their presentation, and if questions do pop up along the way, feel free to use the chat box. All right, take it away, Alex and Matt.
All right, thank you. Let's get a presentation shared. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to get a brief update about the study. Matt's going to spend a lot of time reviewing the technical findings from the different pricing scenarios we've looked at. And then we'll talk a little bit about an expert review panel that was recently held to talk about the project, and then go over schedule and next steps. So this is the goal of the congestion pricing study. Essentially, we're looking to see how congestion pricing could help meet the region's climate and congestion goals and also address safety and equity concerns. An important thing to note here is that this study is not recommending or implementing any pricing measures. We're just studying. So we're hoping that our findings will help inform future discussions on implementation of congestion pricing and on policy recommendations, including efforts currently underway at ODOT and PBOT related to congestion pricing. We'll also outline some next steps for the region for evaluation and further study. Again, we're working to measure our pricing strategies against the region's 4 priorities of equity, climate, safety, and congestion, as identified in the RTP. And the way we're going about that is we're looking at some key performance measures, including vehicle miles traveled, the percentage of people using different modes, accessibility to jobs for both transit and auto trips, vehicle delay, emissions, and cost, both at a regional level and per traveler. And we're looking at 4 different, what we're calling families of tools, different types of congestion pricing. One is a vehicle miles traveled fee, also known as a road user charge, where drivers pay a fee for every mile they travel. Cordon pricing, where a driver pays to enter an area such as downtown Portland, or sometimes to drive within that area. Roadway pricing, where drivers pay to drive on a particular road, bridge, or highway. An example of that is the ODOT tolling work that's going on right now. And parking pricing, where you change the price to park in certain areas. And we've tested 8 different scenarios, 2 from each family. This table is a summary of what we're testing. In terms of how we've structured the technical analysis, we're charging only within the MPA boundaries and using $2010. And we really wanted to compare the effects of different types of charges and the amount charged. So for the 2 VMT or road user charge scenarios, we first looked at increasing the cost of driving by 32%, or cost of travel 32% over the baseline scenario. And the second scenario, 63% over our base. And that comes out to an increase of 6.85 cents per mile and 13.2 cents per mile, respectively. For the 2 cordon scenarios, I'll show some maps in a moment, but we assessed a $5.63 charge to enter the cordon area. And we came to that number by looking at a range of other cities that have implemented or are looking at cordon pricing and picking a number at the higher end of that price range. For the 2 parking scenarios, again, I'll show a map to illustrate where the parking is charged. But for the first one, we assumed parking rates from the 2018 RTP's 2040 financially constrained scenario. And the second one, we doubled those assumptions. And finally, for the roadway scenarios, that's a charge per mile driven on our freeways and highways. For the first one, we looked at using the same per mile charge as the higher VMT charge, but just on the highways. That's 13.2 cents per mile. And again, we doubled that for the second scenario, which was 26.4 cents per mile. So just to help you be more oriented geographically, for the VMT scenarios, again, only charging within the MPA boundaries, which are identified in gray on this map. These are the two Corden scenario maps. On the left, you'll see the smaller Corden boundary, which is downtown Portland, the South Waterfront, and portions of Northwest Portland. And on the right, you'll see that the boundary expands in the larger scenario to include the Lloyd District and the Central East Side on the other side of the river. The important thing to note for the Corden scenarios is when we tested these, we did not assess a charge to any trips that remain on the freeways and highways traveling through the Corden. So I-5, I-405, or the US 26 to Ross Island Bridge trips. Those are not charged. We really wanted to see what happened when we charged drivers to enter the local street network within the Corden area. This map shows the parking scenarios. The lowest charges are in the darkest green, and the charges increase as you move to a lighter green into yellow, orange, and then red is the highest charge. And what you'll see with the legend on the bottom right is that the smallest charge that we looked at in the parking A scenario was 16 cents for long-term parking in those darkest green areas, all the way up to a high of $32.60 per trip for long-term parking in the red. One thing to note here is that again, we're only looking in the MPA boundaries. So the region, the RTP does assume increased pricing in Vancouver, but we did not increase the rates in Vancouver beyond what that assumption is in the base scenario. And finally, the roadway scenarios. This map shows all of our throughways, which are the freeways and limited access highways in the MPA boundaries in red. And those are the routes that we assess the per mile charge to in these scenarios. So with that description of the scenarios out of the way, I just want to provide a very high level summary of the scenario performance before Matt gets into some detailed findings. What we found was that all 4 of the different pricing types helped to address our climate and congestion priorities. And all 8 of the scenarios that we looked at reduced the drive alone rate, vehicle miles traveled, and emissions, while also increasing daily transit trips. We did find that the geographic distribution of the benefits and costs varies by scenario, and Matt will provide some maps that show examples of that, and that there's different trade-offs for implementing the different scenarios. So one more high-level slide before we dive into the details. This table shows you how each scenario performed for each metric that we tested. And just when you're looking at this, green is good. It means better alignment with the regional goals compared to our base scenario. Darker green is better. And then the pinkish orange is less alignment with our regional goals, so it's not as good. And the darker the color is, again, the worse it performed. The gray ones are a minimal change in either direction. And what you see when you look at this table, just looking at a high level, the VMT and parking scenarios at a regional level really had good results for all of the metrics that we tested. In some cases, had very good results without any big red flags at a regional level, at least, for performance on these different metrics. It's a little bit different when you look at the Corden and roadway scenarios. That's not to say that we are saying that these are bad scenarios or that they shouldn't move forward, but we're identifying potential areas for further analysis, particularly vehicle hours of delay and job access. And it's important to note again, these results are before any sort of discounts or exemptions, any reinvestment of revenues or iterations of program design. So this is just testing one single scenario, not making any modifications based on what we found. An actual project moving forward would want to take these results, see where the impacts are, and see if they could make tweaks to the program, such as the area charged, time of day, stuff like that, to see if they can reduce or minimize those impacts. So that's everything at a high level. I think now Matt's going to dive in and talk about some of the specific results that we were seeing. Matt?
You'd think I'd learn by now. First, we're going to go over the volume change maps for the scenarios pretty quickly. Not every one, but an example from each. For VMT, where every trip is tolled, not surprisingly, you see a drop in volumes on just about every roadway in the region. Next. Oh, I should mention too, in the model, people can change their destination as a response to whatever tolling we have. People can change their destination, they can change their mode, they can change their route. What they can't do in our model is change the time of day of their trip, and they can't choose not to make the trip at all. So that's kind of an important background. So VMT, basically every trip is tolled, so you see reductions on just about every facility. Next. The cordons are a little more interesting. You see a drop in volumes inside the cordon, as you'd expect, because those are the only, as trips are told to enter into the cordon. But you see some diversion outside of the cordon area. The roadways that sort of point directly to the cordon and bring traffic to the cordon see reductions. But you can see the freeways like I-5 and I-405, especially in some of the arterials that are adjacent to the cordon, have higher volumes. And you will see some of the impacts of that later on. Next. The parking map, volumes decrease downtown and in streets, again, that are kind of directing traffic towards downtown and in some of the other employment areas. You can see some around Beaverton, Washington Square, but a large portion of the region is pretty much not affected. Next, we're going to look at both roadways. So this is, again, tolling the freeways and highways. And as you'd expect, you see the volumes decrease on those freeways, but you see them increase on the arterials. The next one is roadway B, where we ramp up the cost, and you can see that happening more so. So that's nothing shocking there, but that kind of feeds into the next slides when we look at some of the results. And in our report, we have a slew of different results, but we'll just go over a few of them here. So the first one's VMT. The VMT drops the VMT scenarios in the roadway, as we saw from the maps, had the biggest changes in volumes, and that's where we see the largest change in VMT, but all of them show a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. VMTC and roadway B are greater than 5% reductions in VMT, so pretty large changes. And also when we compare these, how much is a 1% change or a 5% change? The regional transportation plan, the constrained network shows about a 1.6% decrease in VMT compared to the no build. So these are, these would be in addition to that. And so we think these are pretty, significant changes, especially when you're talking about those the VMT numbers. The VMT scenario numbers. Next, the drive alone rate. This is interesting because you can see the roadway and VMT that had the largest VMT reduction. Of course, you'd expect also to have a big change in drive alone, but you also see the cordon and the parking, especially parking B, that has the highest parking rates. Those are tolling mechanisms that impact employment areas. Obviously, the higher we saw from the parking map, the higher charged parking is where there's a lot of employment, and the cordons impact downtown Portland where there's a lot of employment. And those are places with great transit or better transit access than most places. So it's easy to change the drive alone rate with those types of costs. These aren't huge numbers. Most of the scenarios overall are decreased between 0.5 and 1%, but it is interesting to see that phenomenon with the parking and cordon. Next. So jobs accessible by auto. This is how many jobs you can get to within 30 minutes by auto, by TAZ. And so again, you'd expect the VMT scenarios and the roadway scenarios with their, the largest change in volumes to have the biggest increase because the travel times improve for those on the freeways for the roadway and VMTC with just fewer cars on the roads. The cordon actually causes a decrease in jobs accessible by auto. And that's impacting the trips. That's because of that diversion we saw from the arterials from downtown to the arterials around downtown, and especially on I-5 and I-405. So this impacts the jobs accessible really across downtown. Like if you live on the east side, the jobs on the west side are now less accessible because of the increased traffic, increased volumes on I-405 and I-5. Next, so jobs accessible by transit. This is within 45 minutes of transit. And in this one, the roadway is the one that you actually see a decrease in the jobs accessible. And in that one, if you remember the volume map, we saw the diversion from the freeways to the arterials. Well, the buses run on arterials and not so much on the freeway. So the added volumes on the roadway and the slower travel times impacts the transit operations for the roadway scenarios. These are not big changes, sorry, not as big as the other, as by auto. I mean, we're looking at 2.5% and 1% decrease for the worst roadway. Next one. So this is an attempt to look at both the jobs accessibility by auto and the cost. So these bivariate maps include those two data points, and the costs is when we're talking about cost, we're talking about kind of a regional cost. So it includes the operating cost of all the cars. It includes the tolls paid. It also includes the transit fares paid to try to capture those people who changed modes. And what am I missing? Parking costs as well. So for this example, this is the roadway A. You can see that dark purple color is where people have the best combination of higher jobs access and lower costs.
Matt, it's actually the light blue.
Sorry. The light blue has the higher job access and the lower cost. So, but the blue is where we have the better jobs access. And you can see that generally happens along the freeways like 26 and 405 and I-5 and the lower part of 205. So those are places where the jobs access is really improved by the faster travel on the freeways. The other interesting thing is you don't see that much benefit on 84 east of downtown and on the northern part of 205. And that's because those areas have really good jobs access without using the freeway. So improving the freeway travel time, but having that diversion where you're impacting the travel time on arterials, it becomes a wash or even a disbenefit for jobs accessibility. And then the other interesting thing with this one is you see some of the places that have lower jobs access but higher cost tend to be further out. And this is a phenomenon we also saw with I didn't put the map in here, but with the VMT scenarios, especially where, the nice thing about the VMT scenarios is it impacts every single trip. However, that impacts people who don't have those, who live further out more. People who live further out from job centers, they need to drive farther. They have fewer alternatives to driving. So they see more costs without as much opportunity to avoid those costs. So those are the types of things. I think these maps are interesting when you start thinking about what kind of mitigations you would need if you were to implement a program. So I think that might be, is that my last slide, Alex? Yes.
Yeah, it looks like it.
We're going to talk about, Alex is going to talk about some of the costs that instead of looking at the regional look, we're going to look at some specific examples.
Yeah, and in the interest of time, I see we're getting close to the end of our presentation time. I'm just going to show.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe a
5-minute
warning or something.
Yeah. So I'm just going to show one of the few examples that we had pulled up, but the others in the presentation if that's shared afterward. So this is actually Peter Bosa's brainchild. I think he's on the call, of a way to help illustrate with fictional characters how individuals could be affected by these different scenarios. So we looked at how travel times would change and how their auto costs would change. And so in this example, Sally, she lives in Oregon City and she drives to work on Swan Island. And what you can see in the table is that in every different scenario for this trip, Sally sees an improvement in travel time. And in some of them, she sees an improvement in increase in total auto costs. But for some of them, she doesn't pay any more, but she still gets benefit. The interesting thing I found was that it was almost a 1-to-1 ratio of $1 spent and 1 minute saved in travel time. So you can see the more that she spends in these different scenarios, the more travel time she's saving. But some of these scenarios actually get pretty pricey, the cordon B and the 2 roadway scenarios. So we also wanted to look at what if Sally didn't want to pay those costs? What if she wanted to avoid the tolls? And so we calculated that, and we found that she can avoid most of the charge, but she loses all of her benefit in travel time and actually ends up spending more time commuting than she did before if these scenarios were run and she avoided the toll. So there's a couple more examples of that. We have a bunch more that we're going to include in our final report, but we are running low on time. Kyle, did you want to say something again really quick? Sorry, you unmuted.
Oh, there I am off mute. Okay, yeah. Let's see, are you?
I've got 3 more slides, I think.
Oh, you have 3 more, okay, all right.
Yeah, so almost done.
We've got some questions piling up here in the chat.
Awesome. I'll go fast then. Just really quickly to say, we did bring in a group of experts, not modeling experts, but experts in the field of congestion pricing who have worked to implement projects in other parts of the country and around the world to review our methods and technical findings and share insights that they've gained from their work. It was on April 22nd. It was 2.5-hour panel, a great discussion and a question and answer session at the end of it. If anyone's interested in watching that, it was actually really interesting. I will share a link to the recording in the chat after we're all done here. This is just the panelists that we had. It was a great cross section from around the country and different elements of congestion pricing. Generally speaking, the panel did agree with the methods that Metro was using to evaluate congestion pricing, and they thought that the findings we were seeing that Matt was just presenting were not really all that surprising from what they've seen in their work. They did tell us that we should really focus on identifying the problems that we're trying to fix and hone in congestion pricing on dealing with those and not worry necessarily about just raising revenue or trying to fix everything. They also highlighted that we really need to build equity into the start for pricing projects and conduct detailed analysis to see where the benefits and impacts occur and to whom. We've started doing that a little bit with the bivariate map and some other research that we've done that Matt showed. But there's more to be done. And they also, interestingly, found that public support in other projects has changed over time. Early on, people hear about the benefits and there's moderate support. But right before implementation, they start to worry about the costs that they're going to pay. So support plummets, and it's very low. But after implementation, people see the benefits of the project, even with the costs that they're paying, and support bounces back and goes to a moderate high level. So last slide. We've done a lot of work, a lot of modeling. We're incorporating feedback from the expert panel, the Metro Council and JPACT, and combining the findings that Matt was just sharing with additional information on equity and implementation considerations. That's all going to go into a big final report coming out this summer. It talks about how well the different tools perform in our region, if there's areas of concern that should be studied further, which we think there are, and considerations for policymakers and projects that are going forward. And that's it. There's a lot of information, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat and we can answer some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, too. Appreciate it. Lots of good work. And the comment about public support around the tolling, I thought was very appropriate. As we do start to look at congestion pricing in this area, not only with this study, but with some studies going on. It's important. It's important that the first one out of the gate, frankly, gets it right, because you'll set the perception, I think, for any other congestion pricing project that comes downstream from that. So, getting it right the first time is going to be of paramount importance. So I'm glad to see that there's been some comments around that. So let's jump right into the questions here. There's a few of them. I think maybe I will read these two since they're, you know, in some cases addressed to both of you. How about I read them and then I'll let you two kind of decide which one can answer.
Sounds great.
This is from Li Ming. Alex and Matt, can you explain why there are increases in delay in roadway scenarios? I would expect people to drive less when the cost of driving increases. Just a reaction, I guess, around that question.
Is this referring to the volume maps where we had VMT? And well, anyway, you have some, so on the roadway, you have faster travel on the freeways because you're removing volume from that because of the charge. So some people are avoiding that, the freeway and shifting their trip to the arterials. So the arterials are seeing more volumes and more congestion. Our maps weren't showing congestion, they're just showing increased volumes, but you can assume, and we saw in some other data, that we do have some places where there is delay and there is more congestion. So for the roadway, it's because of diversion from the freeways to the arterials. And for the coordinates, a similar story, people avoiding driving through downtown by using avoiding driving on arterials downtown and avoiding that toll, but now shifting onto the freeways around downtown. So that causes congestion on I-5 and I-405.
And I'd add that we did see mode shift and reductions in volumes in both of those scenarios. But for the cordon, there's the only people who have to pay are the people who end in downtown and choose to drive. So anyone who used to cut through downtown, like Matt was saying, they're just increasing volumes on the other routes that avoid the cordon. So you can actually get some of both.
All right. Let's see, moving along here, Tara with ODOT. On the pricing project, did you account for shifts outside of the region with high prices, say Vancouver or the rest of the state?
No, we were.
I guess by shifts, she means traffic volumes outside of the region, yeah.
No, we were just looking at our MPA. So we didn't look at outside the MPA. Yeah. Well, we did some runs where we did, but we, knowing that we are likely would only be able to implement tolling within the MPA, that's where we focused our analysis.
Okay. Becky, also from ODOT. Did you run a VMT scenario with larger fleet proportions of electrics or hybrids?
We did not.
If so, did you report the impact on emissions? Yeah. Okay.
No, so that would all I looked at was the change in price.
Yeah. So you didn't look at obviously changing fleet mix or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah. We don't typically do that in our model right now, and I know you guys use this. So, Alex from ODOT, the peer review I thought was overly critical and not very experienced in VMT charges. To me, VMT seems like the clear winner. I'm just curious for any Metro perspective on that post-peer review discussion.
I'd say VMT, just from a volume reduction perspective at a regional level, is a clear winner, but it's pretty indiscriminate in how it tries to solve the problem. So it depends on what your problem is that you're trying to solve. If you're just trying to reduce the volumes generally across the region, it definitely shows some promise. But if you're looking to target specific corridors or parts of the region, the other scenarios may have advantages. But I don't think as a Metro team, I don't think we've discounted any of the scenarios and said that they're infeasible or not worth pursuing any further.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. As I recall, some of the highest transit shifting, mode shifting within the scenarios, I believe, is around one or two of the parking scenarios, if I recall correctly. And so I thought that was, well, on a couple different levels, I thought it was interesting just to be able to show the sensitivity of people's decisions and trade-offs around time versus cost, right? If you're charging a higher parking cost, say downtown by an employment center, like Matt mentioned, and people now choose instead of driving to get on transit, you would assume that that's probably a higher trip time or a higher travel time now. And so being able to kind of show that sensitivity of where exactly people are willing to trade off their time in response to costs, I thought was interesting and made for a very interesting scenario. So anyways, that was one of the scenarios that I thought was interesting. I don't know if I'd call it a winner per se, but I thought it was pretty cool to see and to quantify. Josh Roll.
Can I jump in there real quick?
Oh, yeah.
About the VMT scenario? I mean, like Alex said, it had really good results. It also it's not a big charge per person because it's charged to everybody every driving trip. So some of the other ones, it's a pretty, like the parking is a pretty big cost to pay for the few people. It's like a few people are bearing the brunt of it. So that's one nice thing about the VMT. On the other hand, like I mentioned before, I think you have to be concerned for people who don't have options other than driving and need to drive a long way, and pretty much in the rural area. So that's one of the drawbacks of that one. You don't have a choice. The other scenarios, you have a choice to not pay the toll. So, okay, sorry. Go on, Kyle.
Yeah, Josh Roll from ODOT. It would be ideal to also consider safety outcomes by looking at the VMT changes by roadway functional class. Digging into the aggregate VMT reduction, some scenarios showing increases on certain corridors due to diversion. Can you split the VMT changes out by functional classification? Less VMT on interstates, but more on arterials, and potentially diversion from arterials to local streets. Could shift costs from freeway travelers to residents in neighborhoods under some scenarios. The cost change from delay for freeway users to safety issues for residents. Yeah, so that diversion to local facilities and increase in VMT and what that means to potentially safety outcomes. You guys have a reaction around that?
Yeah, our study, sorry, Matt, our study didn't have an opportunity to really get into the safety ramifications of that. But one of our considerations that we're going to put forward is that that's something that should be looked at, particularly in terms of reinvestment of revenues, areas where we might be negatively impacting safety, and what we can do to mitigate that, whether that's new crosswalks, wider sidewalks, whatever the case may be. Those are areas that we'd want to look to reinvest that revenue to improve safety. Do you have something to add, Matt?
Oh.
No, I mean, that's something we could do and we didn't do. There are lots of things we could do that were just limited by time. So that's safety is one we kind of punted on as far as the model is concerned.
Let's see. I believe there's like 3 more. We have 2 minutes. So why don't we send these out, Matt, to you and Alex, and maybe you guys could follow up. I'll have Carol get a hold of you two with these questions, and maybe you guys can just put some language to them, and we'll send them back out to the group. How does that sound? Just in the interest of time. Carol, does that sound like something that might work?
We can certainly do that if Matt and Alex have time to respond to them that way.
Yeah,
it's fine.
Take it as a good sign. Lots of interest in your work. I knew this would be a good topic, and thank you guys so much for presenting today. And hopefully we can get you back and give us an update on this work, or potentially some work in the future that you guys are doing. The investment group, investment corridor group, is always kind of leading the region and looking at new corridors to study, and it's always interesting. Some of the tools and analysis that you guys do, and I think pertinent to bring back to this group. So again, thank you very much. And with that, I think we'll move to our final presenter, Lisa Zorn from